Omari was born on the darkest day the village had ever known, a day when the sun refused to rise. As he grew, strange whispers followed him wherever he went. People dismissed it as childish nonsense, until one night the whispers turned into warnings of doom. Now, the entire village must confront an impossible question. Can they trust the boy who speaks to shadows, or are they already too late? The story begins on a day unlike any other. The sun had risen as it always did, bathing the village in golden light. But by midday the light dimmed, the sky darkened, and the air grew still. The villagers looked up in awe and fear as the solar eclipse began. It was on this eerie day that Omari came into the world. His cries echoed through the village as the sun's light was swallowed by shadow. The elders whispered among themselves, their faces grim. A child born during an eclipse, one muttered, "It's a bad omen." Others shook their heads. Superstition had no place in their village, they insisted, but deep down, the unease lingered. Omari grew up like any other child, but from the beginning, there was something different about him. While other children ran through the fields and played in the dusty streets, Omari preferred to sit in the shade, staring at the ground. Sometimes, villagers would find him alone, laughing softly. When asked who he was laughing with, he would simply point to his shadow and say, "They're funny." His mother dismissed it at first. "Children have wild imaginations," she'd say with a smile, ruffling his curly hair. But as Omari grew older, his behavior became harder to ignore. He started having long conversations with no one in sight. "They're my friends," he explained when questioned. "The shadows, they talk to me." The other children mocked him, calling him the shadow's son. But Omari didn't seem to mind. He didn't need their friendship. He had the shadows. The first strange event happened when Omari was just 7 years old. The village was buzzing with excitement, preparing for the annual harvest festival. Brightly colored fabrics swayed in the breeze, strung between the huts, and the rhythmic beat of drums echoed through the air. It was a time of joy and celebration, a moment when the villagers came together to honor their hard work and the blessings of the land. Magir, as usual, sat quietly in the shade near the square, tracing shapes in the dirt with a stick. He didn't seem particularly interested in the festivities, but that was nothing new. The other children ran past him, laughing and playing, but Omari stayed rooted in his spot, staring at his shadow as if it were whispering to him. That night, the village went to sleep under a blanket of stars, dreaming of the festivities to come. But by morning, the air was thick with tension. When the first villagers arrived at the festival grounds, they were greeted by a shocking sight. The main festival tent, the pride of their celebration, lay in ruins. The sturdy poles that held it upright had been snapped clean in half, as if by some immense force. The colorful fabric was shredded, pieces of it scattered across the square like leaves after a storm. But there had been no storm, no wind strong enough to cause such destruction. Whispers spread like wildfire through the village. "What could have done this?" one woman murmured, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "It must have been animals," another man suggested, though even he didn't seem convinced. When Omari arrived with his mother, he stopped in his tracks, staring at the destroyed tent. The other children pointed and gasped, but Omari's face remained calm, unreadable. "What happened here?" one of the elders asked, his voice heavy with concern. Omari looked up at him, his dark eyes steady. "The shadows didn't like it," he said simply. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Some of the villagers laughed nervously, brushing off his comment as childish nonsense. "The boy and his strange imagination," one of them muttered. But others couldn't shake the unease creeping into their hearts. Later that day, some of the elders inspected the damage more closely. "This doesn't look like the work of animals," one of them said quietly. As the sun set, a strange tension settled over the village. The laughter and music that usually filled the air during festival preparations were replaced by hushed voices and stolen glances toward Omari. His mother tried to comfort him that evening, "People are just on edge," she said, stroking his hair. "They don't mean to make you feel different." Omari didn't respond. Instead, he stared at the wall, his voice soft but firm. "They tend to like Vitant. They don't like the drums either." His mother froze a chill running down her spine. "Who doesn't like them, Omari?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The shadows," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That night, many in the village couldn't sleep, and while they didn't want to admit it, Omari's words had planted a seed of fear that was only beginning to grow. As the years went by, the quiet village began to change. Strange things happened, things no one could explain. The first incident was small, almost easy to ignore. A goat vanished from its pen one night, leaving no tracks or signs of struggle. The villagers searched high and low, combing the nearby woods, but the animal was never found. "Probably a wild animal," they muttered, shaking their heads. But the unease lingered. Then came the fire. It started in the storage hut, the one used to keep the village's grain safe for the harsh seasons. By the time the flames were noticed, it was too late. The structure was gone, and the grain with it. Strangely, no one could determine how the fire had started. There was no lightning that night, no unattended lamps nearby. It seemed to have come from nowhere. The villagers grew restless, whispering among themselves. "Bad luck," they said, "a run of misfortune." But deep down, they felt something more sinister was at play. Each time something happened, Omari would watch quietly from the edge of the crowd. When asked what he thought, he would always give the same chilling response: "The shadows are angry." At first, the villagers brushed it off. "He's just a boy," they'd say. "His imagination is too wild." They tried to laugh it away, but his words left a mark, an invisible scar that grew deeper with every passing incident. The accidents didn't stop. A woman's clay pots shattered mysteriously in the middle of the night, though no one had been near them. The village's well dried up for an entire day before the water returned, leaving everyone anxious and thirsty. Each time, Omari would quietly repeat his warning: "The shadows are angry." Mothers would call their children away when Omari walked by. Men would lower their voices when he approached. His mother noticed, of course, and tried to shield him from the growing fear in their eyes. "They're just scared of what they don't understand," she told him, her voice gentle. But Omari wasn't scared. He never was. That's what made it so unsettling. And then, one day, something happened that no one could ignore. A farmer's livestock, all of it, vanished overnight. Not a single track, not a single sound to indicate what had happened. The villagers gathered at the scene, murmuring nervously. "This isn't normal," one man said, his voice shaking. Omari stood at the edge of the group, silent as always, but this time he didn't wait for someone to ask him. "The shadows have warned you," he said, his voice calm but unnervingly certain. "They're tired of being ignored." His words spread through the crowd like wildfire, sending chills down every spine, and for the first time, no one laughed. "It's just a boy's imagination," one elder said weakly, but even he sounded unsure, because deep down, everyone knew. The boy wasn't harmless anymore. One evening, Omari sat in the village square, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. A group of elders approached him, curious about his strange behavior. "What are you doing, Omari?" one asked. Without looking up, Omari replied, "The shadows are speaking. They're unhappy." The elders exchanged nervous glances. Unhappy? About what? Omari finally looked up, his dark eyes calm but piercing. "They say the village has forgotten them. They want something back. What do they want?" Omari tilted his head, as if listening to a voice only he could hear. Then he whispered, "A sacrifice." The news spread like wildfire. By nightfall, the entire village was in uproar. Some were terrified, believing Omari's words to be a warning from the spirits. Others dismissed it as nonsense, blaming his strange behavior on his birth during the eclipse. Omari's mother pleaded with the villagers. "He's just a child," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He doesn't know what he's saying." But Omari's calm demeanor unsettled everyone. "Lebusha duri lai," he said simply. "If you don't give them what they want, they'll take it themselves." The villagers were torn. Was the boy cursed? Was he blessed? And most importantly, was he telling the truth? That night, the village was plagued by nightmares. Men, women, and children woke in a cold sweat, haunted by visions of shadowy figures creeping through their homes. The next morning, Omari delivered another message. "They are losing patience," he said. "Tonight they'll come." The villagers were gripped by fear. They turned to the elders, begging for guidance. "What should we do?" they cried. "How do we stop this?" The oldest elder, a man named Baba, stepped forward. "There is an old ritual," he said, "one that hasn't been performed in generations. It may be our only hope." The entire village gathered in the square as the sun began its descent, painting the sky with streaks of orange and red. It would have been beautiful if not for the heavy air of fear that surrounded them. No one spoke. The only sounds were the soft shuffle of feet and the rustle of clothing as the villagers formed a circle around Omari. He stood in the center, a small figure against the backdrop of looming adults. His dark, steady eyes betrayed no fear, though the same couldn't be said for the villagers. They avoided his gaze, their faces pale, their hands trembling as they linked together to begin the ritual. Baba, the oldest elder, stepped forward, his voice cracking as he began to chant ancient words. These were words that hadn't been spoken for generations, not since the ancestors had sealed away the darkness long ago. The sound of the chant filled the air, rising and falling like the wind, carrying with it a weight of desperation. The villagers joined in, their voices unsteady and faltering. Some whispered the words, others stumbled over them, but the circle held firm. The more they chanted, the colder the air became. The warm glow of the sunset dimmed, replaced by an unnatural chill that seeped into their bones. Then it happened. At first it was subtle, a flicker at the edges of the square. Shadows that should have stayed still began to shift, moving unnaturally against the fading light. The villagers gasped, their chanting faltering, but Baba raised a hand, urging them to continue. The shadows crept closer, their movements slow and deliberate. What had once been vague, shapeless forms now began to take on human-like figures, twisting and bending as if they were alive. The villagers clutched each other's hands tighter, some whispering prayers under their breath. "They're here," Omari said suddenly, his voice cutting through the chanting like a blade. All eyes turned to him. He wasn't scared. He wasn't even surprised. He stood tall, his small frame seeming to carry strength far beyond his years. The shadows stopped just short of the circle, their forms towering over the villagers. One reached out, its hands stretching unnaturally long, its dark, smoky fingers curling toward Omari. The air was thick with tension, so heavy it felt hard to breathe. Omari turned to Baba, his voice calm but firm. "They want me," he said simply. "No!" his mother screamed from the edge of the circle, tears streaming down her face. She tried to step forward, but the other villagers held her back. Omari raised a hand, silencing the cries and protests around him. "It's okay," he said, his tone steady. "This is what they've been waiting for. It has to be me." Before anyone could stop him, Omari stepped out of the circle. The shadows surged forward, swirling around him like smoke caught in a storm. Their forms grew darker, denser, until they completely enveloped the boy. "Omari!" his mother shrieked, breaking free from the crowd and rushing forward. But it was too late. In an instant, the shadows vanished, taking Omari with them. The square fell into a deafening silence, broken only by the sound of his mother's anguished sobs as she collapsed to the ground. The villagers stood frozen, their faces pale and their hearts heavy. They didn't know if they had witnessed a sacrifice, a punishment, or something else entirely. Omari was gone, and the darkness that had haunted their village disappeared with him. But at what cost? In the quiet that followed, Baba's voice trembled as he spoke. The shadows demanded balance, and now they have it. The village would never be the same, and as the night fell, the only question that lingered was whether Omari had been cursed or chosen. The village was silent for days. The nightmares stopped, and the strange accidents ceased. But the weight of what had happened hung heavy in the air. Omari's mother sat alone by the river, clutching the last drawing he had made in the dirt, a simple outline of a boy standing with his shadow. The villagers whispered about Omari for years to come. Some called him a curse, others called him a savior. But one thing was certain: the shadows had taken him, and he was never seen again. This is the story of Omari, the boy who spoke to shadows. Was he a victim of fate or a bridge between worlds? In the end, the answer didn't matter. His story became a warning to those who dared to forget the unseen forces that lurk in the darkness. If you found this story chilling and thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to African Narrators. Stay tuned for more tales of mystery, suspense, and unforgettable lessons from the heart of Africa.